Good evening. Good evening. I see we've had a few more folks join us. We'll get started in just 1 minute. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kyra Skunyon, and I am the immediate past president and a proud member of the Harford County Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And I'm also serving as the second vice president of the Harford County NAACP branch. So on behalf of both organizations, I just want to welcome you here this evening. Thank you for joining us. The fact that you are here with us this evening shows that you are interested in learning more about the process and how to best use your voice to advocate. So we just commend you for making the time to join us this evening for this session. This session this evening, Advocacy 101, is put on in partnership by the Harford County Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta and the NAACP branch. So we'll dig into the statewide legislative redistricting process, how to read legislative bills and have an understanding of the General Assembly, and then ways to engage in forums like County Council, Board of Education meetings, and other ways that we can make sure that our voices are heard. So Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated was founded in 1913. It's a global not-for-profit organization whose purpose is to provide assistance and support through established programs in local communities all throughout the world. There are more than 1,000 chapters, both collegiate and alumni, all over the world, and they focus on 5 areas: economic development, educational development, international awareness and involvement, physical and mental health, and political awareness and involvement, with a primary focus on the Black community. The NAACP, which really is one of the oldest and most preeminent social and racial justice organizations, was founded in 1909. And the vision is to ensure a society in which all individuals have equal rights and there is no racial hatred or discrimination. With more than 2,200 units or branches and more than 2 million members, the NAACP works to make sure that Black voices are heard, demands are met, and Black excellence is amplified in all areas of society. So the group works to ensure that political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights for all people. So we are really happy that the 2 local organizations, local branches of those organizations, have come together today just to provide you with a little more information about advocacy. At this time, I would like to turn it over to the president of the Harford County Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Carla Walton, for her brief welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I really am missing us having these types of events in person, but I know that in this virtual reality, we will still be able to get this work done. And so thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I know that we're going to learn a lot, and we're going to be able to move forward in a better way as it relates to advocacy in Harford County.
Thank you, Carla. And on behalf of the Harford County branch of the NAACP, and on behalf of our president, Vicki Jones, who will be joining us this evening, I just want to welcome you, say thank you for making this a priority. We know that there are a number of places where everyone could be this evening, or just doing nothing, right? And just chilling out and spending some time watching TV or hanging with your families, but we really commend you for making the time to make this session a priority. So thank you so much for joining us. I also want to challenge everyone and remind everyone that the work of the NAACP includes everyone. We want advocates and allies all across the community. So if you have an interest in the work of the NAACP, I'm going to drop a link in the chat. Please feel free to check out more about our organization and feel free to join if you'd like to do so. We are so fortunate this evening. We not only have an amazing moderator and presenter, but we also have a number of partner organizations. I see members of partner organizations who are here with us today. So I see our other vice president in the NAACP, Kevin McKinney, has joined us. I see a number of members of the Harford County NAACP, members of the Harford County Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We also see members of the League of Women Voters here with us as well. So we thank all of you for joining us this evening. Now, tonight, we are fortunate to have with us a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated's National Social Action Commission, who has extensive experience in regulatory and government affairs as well. Kimberly Robinson is an influential voice in Annapolis and is no stranger to advocacy at all levels of government. So we are just so happy that she is taking the time to spending the time with us this evening to take us through a number of different areas. So I will turn it over now to Kimberly Robinson.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you all this evening. Good evening again. My name is Kimberly Robinson. I want to say thank you to Chapter President Carla Walton, to Madam Vice President for the NAACP, for their partnership and their vision in putting on this event today, and for the very gracious invitation to share with you. It really is my pleasure, and my passion is teaching communities how to advocate. Delta Sigma Theta has such a rich social action history, starting from our inception in 1913 on until today, and it has been one of my greatest joys of the last 22 years of membership to be involved in the social action work of the sorority and have the opportunity to help educate communities and move them forward in being able to raise their voice. And so today, I was asked to provide essentially an Advocacy 101 presentation, an opportunity to do a basic level set grounding on some of the key issues and things that you would want to know as you may be looking to become more engaged in the advocacy work in Harford County and in your own communities. And that's what I'm going to try to provide you this evening. We've got time saved for Q&A at the end, but I'm going to ask for my sisters of Harford County, if you've got your eye in the chat, if a question happens to pop up along the way that it makes sense that maybe I pause and answer, please feel free to just stop and interrupt me and ask me to answer it then. Because I'll be sharing my screen, anybody who's done a lot of work on Zoom knows it's hard to do the talking, do the screen sharing, and read the chat. So I won't be able to look at it myself. So Madam Technology Chair, if you're able to, feel free to stop me at any point. And we're gonna get started with me sharing my screen. In one moment while we get our presentation up. Are you seeing the Advocacy 101 slide?
Yes, yep, we see it.
Perfect. All right, so good evening again, and that's what we're here for. We're gonna talk about Advocacy 101, and we're gonna jump right in. So let's talk about what is advocating. And we're gonna start by level setting what is advocating versus lobbying. I am professionally what's known as a lobbyist. I literally have a badge from the state of Maryland that says lobbyist on it because I am registered with the state of Maryland, who requires that lobbyists actually be registered with the state. We have to be identified. We have a lot of transparent reporting. I'm sure we've all seen over many, many years those horrible stories, particularly at the federal level of, things like pay to play and lobbyists, whining and dining legislators and giving gifts and trying to buy influence. Maryland has very specific set of laws that define what lobbying is and place requirements on what lobbyists can or can't do. So just to give you some idea, for instance, in the state of Maryland, I can't buy a meal for a legislator except under the most narrow of circumstances. I can't spend money on them. I can't give them gifts. So when we talk about lobbying, it's a legal term, it's defined, it's got all of these requirements around it, and it's really focused on someone who's being paid for those services, who's doing so on behalf of their employer or their client. And it is, that's the reason why we tend not to want to use that term when we talk about ourselves doing this work as community members, because if you say I'm lobbying on something, it gives people the impression that you might fall into a different category, and we don't want to start asking questions about, well, are you registered? You know, are you getting paid for this, et cetera, when you're not. So in the volunteer space, we talk about advocacy, and Delta Sigma Theta members across the country, NAACP members across the country, League of Women Voter members across the country are very, very effective advocates in their community, using their influence to make changes and to affect policy. So when we talk about what advocacy really is, it is creating public support or opposition for recommendations about a particular cause or policy. And in practice, it's that influence of decision makers. We are trying to, ensure that they are shaping a curriculum a particular way, that they are funding our schools a particular way, that they are taking care of our transportation infrastructure a particular way, that they are passing laws or making policy in our communities that we think is appropriate for our needs. And those decision makers can be elected or appointed. It just depends on where you are and what the position is. So the first most important thing to understand about advocacy is who are you trying to influence? And the list of potential people who are making decisions for your community is frankly quite large. This is just a high level of people who may be the elected decision makers you may want to influence, starting all the way at the top with the President of the United States, our congressional representatives in the House of Representatives, our US senators, we've got 2 from every state, including our own Chris Van Hollen and Ben Cardin from the state of Maryland, the governor, the attorney general in our state who was elected, unlike the federal attorney general, for instance, who was appointed, our state representatives in our Maryland House of Delegates, our state senators in the Maryland Senate. And then as we start to move more local, our county executives, Baltimore County, where I live, we've got a county executive. Harford County has Barry Glassman as your current county executive, your state's attorney, your county council members, school board representatives. If you were in Baltimore, you would have a mayor and a city council instead to be influencing. The list can go on. And then on top of that, within most governments, you've got agencies who also make policy and can make decisions that are going to affect what happens in your community. For instance, the local Department of Health. The health commissioner is going to be appointed by your county executive, or at the state level, the secretary of the department, the Maryland Department of Health is appointed by the governor. But those individuals and the agencies that they work for also are making policy decisions. We've watched that for the last 2 years in COVID. The Maryland Department of Health made decisions about access to vaccines and vaccine requirements, how they were rolled out, who was going to be able to get them where they set up clinics. At the county level, counties also did their own clinics. Were they stationary? Were they mobile? All of those policies are decisions being made by someone. And so the first thing is to really understand who are making the decisions that affect our lives. That goes all the way down, for instance, to your Department of Public Works. Who fixes your streetlights, who fixes your potholes, who makes sure that the water is on in your neighborhood if a water main breaks. Everyone out there working in our government shapes what our day-to-day experience looks like. And it's important that we understand who those agencies, who those people, who those appointed, and who those electeds are. So, and also some additional potential electeds. This could even include elected sheriffs, judges, court clerks, and more. And I want to highlight some of those offices because one of the things that we encourage our members to do as they get more sophisticated within their chapters and their community education is to spend some time on what people call, quote unquote, down ballot offices. Everybody kind of has an idea about the president and the governor. and then maybe about, your delegates and your senators. But as you move your way down that ballot, all of a sudden people stop and go, I don't know what an orphan's clerk of the court does. I don't know what the sheriff does per se. And people get a little bit more reticent to even vote in those races. But sometimes those people are really important. And I'll give you an example when it comes to sheriffs. In many jurisdictions, sheriff's offices are the ones who serve warrants as opposed to the police department. If we reflect on the Breonna Taylor case, Breonna Taylor was killed during the quote unquote attempt to serve a warrant. And understanding who is responsible for that, how they go about their business, what kind of accountability they're willing to accept, understanding what the history of your sheriff's office is with, although Maryland has now banned no-knock warrants, but prior to, what is the history of no-knock warrants in your county? What is the history of warrants being served on the wrong address or the wrong person? Come back to these offices that when they fly under the radar, we aren't really keeping a good eye on what's happening in our communities. And so as we move into the 2022 election cycle here in Maryland, I encourage all chapters, all partners, to take a look at who's on the ballot in your jurisdiction and start to help familiarize your community with all the offices and the office holders who are going to stand for election in 2022. And once you know who those people are, get to know them. It's something that, because I've done this work for very long, there was a point at which I realized I took it for granted, that I know a lot of electeds because I'm literally paid to do so. It's my responsibility to be able to do my job effectively. But it's more important, frankly, that these electeds know you as their constituents, that they know you as the voters who put them in office, and that they should know you as the voters who have the right to put them out of their job if they're not doing the things you want them to do. But often I find that community members don't really appreciate that they have the right to know their electeds and should know them on a personal basis and how to go about it. At the end of the day, they're just people. And I will say that here in Maryland, our electeds on balance are all generally very nice people. They tend to be very accessible. They do want to hear from their constituents. And what happens often is that constituents aren't speaking up. So I encourage communities and organizations to do what we're doing here, but instead invite your local elected to come, if we were in a non-COVID world, to have coffee with your members, whether it's the NAACP or the League of Women Voters or Harford County alumni, invite them to come sit down, give them the platform to talk about what their priorities are for your community. Give them the space to share what they have or haven't accomplished. Take the opportunity to tell them what's important to you. Let them know if they aren't doing things that are pleasing to you, that they aren't addressing the issues you think are important, or let them know when they are. Attend their public meeting. And if they're not having public opportunities for the community to come hear from them, if they're not doing the town halls or the community meetings, let them know that maybe you think that's not appropriate and that they need to put themselves out there and engage with the community. Sometimes they're hiding because they don't want to hear back from people, and that tells you a lot about that elected. Electeds who are looking to be really responsive often will take the time to find ways to engage with the community. Sometimes their challenge is the community doesn't show up. So become a partner in putting that information out. We are all nonpartisan organizations. And so while we can't endorse candidates for office, we won't pick and choose who we think ought to win. If you've got a sitting elected who's having a community meeting, you absolutely can share that with your audience. That's a community event. The fact that it's being held by an elected doesn't change the fact that people ought to be able to attend that. So there's a way to make sure that you are behaving as a nonpartisan organization while getting that information to your community. Get to know their staff. I think we've all had the experience at work or another part of our lives where you come to understand that sometimes the executive assistant is really the most important person in the office. And so knowing their staff can be also a really great tactic to be able to get information, to find opportunities, to look for ways to partner, to get just information about things that are happening when you build out that relationship and they come to understand you are a go-to organization in the community. When that elected has something they do want to push out, there is several legislators, for instance, in Maryland, give legislative scholarships, and sometimes they're looking to find the right audience to share that information with. Be that audience. Make sure they know if you've got an opportunity you need to push out. If you're hiring high school interns to come work in your office, either locally or at the General Assembly, when they're recruiting for pages at the General Assembly, we want to help you identify high school students who can fill those spaces. It's also a great way that we make sure that diverse students get the opportunities to do those things regardless of the county that they live in. So get to know the staff, and then absolutely share your thoughts. I was in a community conversation and I was listening to several community members who were sort of railing on and on about how their representative wasn't prioritizing the things they thought were important to them. And I finally just stopped and asked, well, you know, what have you told him about what your priorities are? And they paused and looked at me and said, well, what do you mean? I mean, have you told them that that's the most important thing you would like to see him accomplish in Annapolis? They were like, oh, well, no. I said, well, if you've never told him, how would he know that's what you care about? Very often, we sort of assume that our electeds know what our priorities are or what we care about as a community. And some things, big ticket things, sure, they know we care about schools. Everybody knows everybody cares about schools. But what about it? What is it that you want to see done in your school? What is it that you want to see prioritized about what the Department of Education is doing here in the state or within your school board? What are the specific things? Because legislators aren't mind readers. And we all know the old adage that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. If you aren't speaking up and telling them what you care about, I promise you, someone else is. And that group's interests are going to be the ones that they seek to address because they're the only ones they've heard from. It's not even a conscious decision to ignore you. It's just that they can only respond to what's in front of them. I'm looking particularly at our immediate past president of Harford County Alumni and our current president, who I think truly, and I'm a past president of my own chapter, the Baltimore Metropolitan Alumni Chapter, who understand that feeling of, I don't know what my members want if they don't tell me. I need you to let me know how you're thinking and what you're feeling and what you want to see us do, because I'm not clairvoyant, and our legislators aren't either. But I find that that's a point that sometimes is lost in our communities, that you're not being a squeaky wheel in a bad way, you're not being a bother, but you should absolutely send that email, you should absolutely pick up the phone, you should absolutely ask for the meeting and let them know what your priorities are. And then once you cultivate those relationships on a personal level, not as a chapter or as an organization, but as individuals, understand as a member of the community, you should support those representatives who do the things that you believe in, who vote the way you think they should, who prioritize what you think they should. And this becomes particularly important for candidates of color and Black candidates, because history tells us that they tend to struggle with fundraising. They do not get the same level of donation that their counterparts of other races get. And at the end of the day, elections take money. And so it's also important that we cultivate not only a culture of advocacy, but also a culture of political giving, because the reality is that's also where our community garners influence. And we do that on an individual level rather than as an organization. All right, so I'm going to just pause there for a second. That was really sort of the first chapter of this presentation, focusing on advocacy. Like I said, even though I know we've got time specifically saved for Q&A at the end, before we shift topics, were there any specific questions about anything I've said thus far?
No questions noted in the chat.
Okay, well, we'll keep going and then we'll see where we are when we get to Q&A. So now that we've talked about what advocacy is, what advocacy looks like, who we are influencing when we're advocating, we're going to delve into our first specific topic when we are looking at things that are happening locally and what is one of the hottest topics here and across the country. And right now, it's redistricting. In Delta, we sort of refer to redistricting as Census Part 2. we spent, as many of our partner organizations represented here did as well, most of last year trying to get people to complete the decennial census. The census is the first step towards redistricting because it is the process by which we collect all of the data that feeds into the redistricting process. Census, like redistricting, only happens every 10 years, which makes it sometimes a challenge. But if you think about it, you know, if you were 2 the last time it happened, you're 12 now, and you won't see it again till you're 22, and then you won't see it again till you're 32. It's a pretty big gap. And it takes a lot for people to kind of keep their eye on the ball, which is why I think all of our organizations have to work so hard each cycle to try to educate the community about its importance. And as we move forward in time, things like technology have been both a help and a hamper. We've got a lot of skepticism about technology, having the census be very tech-driven, people doing it online, you can do it from your phone, you can do it over the phone. Did, I think, for some communities have a chilling effect. All of the intentional talk by some in leadership about undocumented individuals who are to be counted in the census, but were essentially sort of low-key threatened with possible deportation, which is actually against the law to use the census information for that purpose, had a chilling effect. But those individuals are still living in communities and should have been counted to get a proper number of individuals when it came to the census, because it's going to determine what the funding that communities get and what the numbers are when it comes to each jurisdiction for redistricting. But here we are, 2021, and states have finally received their census numbers, late compared to where they ought to have been thanks to COVID, but received them and are now going through this process. And so redistricting is, in its most simple, pardon my typo, but in its most simple form, is the process of redrawing congressional and legislative and other political boundaries. It is the process to determine whether you are in District 1 or District 7 or District 8 or District 44B. It is where our leaders get together and carve up the state into these districts at several different levels. We do them at the congressional level, we do them at the legislative level, we do them at the county council level. Depending on how your school board is arranged, you may do them at the school board level. Baltimore City will do it at the city council level. All of these districts determine who represents you, and redistricting can affect political power. Maryland is poised to adopt its congressional maps this December during a special session, and its legislative maps after the new year during the regular session. So Maryland traditionally meets in regular session beginning on the second Wednesday in January and concludes 90 days later on the second Monday in April. And that's considered the regular session. But the legislative leadership, the speaker and the president, can request the governor to call a special session outside of those 90 days to handle specific pieces of business. And in this case, they've asked for, and he has called, a special session to commence on December 6th for the purposes of considering the congressional maps for the redistricting process. They need to be adopted now before the end of this year, and the legislative maps will be adopted, have to be adopted by our Constitution during the regular session. When we talk about how redistricting affects political power, there's a couple different ways. So I didn't do a slide on it, but I can certainly add one in when I provide this deck to the chapter to share. One of the things that we talk about a lot in the context of redistricting, it's what's known as gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is the process by which one impacts who is likely to win a district by where you place the line. And I'm thinking I'm going to stop this share for just a second. I think I might have a visual that might help on this particular topic. So we're going to see if I can't grab that for you all really quickly. Gerrymandering is often talked about in terms of political gerrymandering, but it also happens in other ways. It can happen based on race in particular, and is often litigated when that is the case. The law in our country prohibits racial gerrymandering, but it doesn't prohibit political gerrymandering. So that is a particular difference in what is allowed and what is not allowed. Although there have definitely been states who've been accused and found to have racially gerrymandered their states and had the courts redraw their districts for them. Well, I guess it doesn't have the visual. That's all right. We'll just stay where we are. So, but we're going to talk about gerrymandering for just a second because this is relevant in the debate in our home state. Maryland has long been considered one of the most politically gerrymandered states in the country. Maryland, unlike the other states on that list, has a different political party in power. So the majority of states that are listed as being highly politically gerrymandered tend to be Republican-led. Maryland is a Democratic-led state who's also pretty gerrymandered. And that matters because, again, it is about how we are creating political power. If one can draw the lines to dilute the voices of one party over another, you can in many ways guarantee the party you want to see win is going to win. Similarly, if you can draw the lines to dilute the presence of one group of people or another, you can not 100% guarantee, but you can significantly influence the likelihood that a member of a particular group is going to win or not. I will use my home county of Baltimore County as an example. Baltimore County Council had an independent redistricting commission who proposed a map that has not been well received in our local community. It maintains Baltimore County's council with 8 seats, with one district that would be described, and I personally don't care for this term, but it's the one that's used in this space, as a minority majority district, meaning that more than 50% of the people in the district are of color. It is the only district that has ever elected a county council member of color. And even that district was drawn after the county was sued 20 years ago over its then map that did not create a minority majority district, despite having a high concentration of African Americans on the west side of Baltimore County. They were broken up as communities and set into other districts that arguably diluted their political power and made it hard for a candidate of color to win. And so the courts redrew the map, created what is for us District 4, and it has been the only district in 20 years to ever send a person of color to our county council. Baltimore County's number of people of color has gone up, and Baltimore County is now sitting at a voting age population of about 46% people of color, 30% of which are African American. And given those numbers, while there is some scattering of people across the county, our local NAACP, the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, have drawn maps that they believe could create 2 minority majority districts and 1 quote unquote toss-up district where the numbers are split almost 50-50 that at least gives a candidate of color a fighting chance. And the county council continues to seem unwilling to consider the creation of that second minority majority district. In a county where almost half of the voting age people are of color, there's a lot of consternation about the idea that the mapping is likely to lock us in to still only having 1 representative of color on the county council, where arguably sitting at 46%, perhaps we ought to have 3 and maybe even 4. So where the lines land becomes very, very important. For our partner organizations, I know many of you have been very engaged in the redistricting process at the state level. Delta Sigma Theta has been incredibly involved in the redistricting process here in Maryland and across the country. Yesterday, on behalf of my chapter, I testified alongside 2 other chapters presidents about the congressional maps and the legislative maps and the things we want to see for the Baltimore area. And so being able to engage, to raise our voices, and to try to educate the community is really, really important. And I encourage you all, come December 6th, when the special session begins, to tune in to what's happening at the General Assembly. And when we talk about the General Assembly, I'll show you where to find some of that information when we get there.
Kimberly, quick question that fits here. So when you say, this is a question from the chat, when you say legislative, do you mean state legislature? And then when you say congressional, do you mean US or federal?
Great question. And you pegged it, absolutely. When I say congressional, I specifically mean Maryland's 8 congressional districts that send our representatives to the House of Representatives, because we all know, right, we've got 8 Congress people who represent the state of Maryland. So we've got districts 1 through 8. So when I say congressional, I'm really talking about them because, of course, our senators are statewide, so they don't have districts, but we're talking about their 8 congressional districts. And when I say legislative, I am speaking of the 47 legislative districts for the state representatives and our state senators for the Maryland General Assembly. So that's a very good question. And I'll just pause there for a second. Maryland, by its constitution, has 47 senators and 141 delegates. And historically, Maryland has created its districts with 1 senator and 3 delegates. So 141 is 47 times 3. So that's how we get to that 141 for 188 legislators total. There are a couple of exceptions to the 3 delegate rule, some of which have been the result of redistricting challenges. They, in some places, you'll have a 44A that has 2 delegates, and then a 44B where that 3rd delegate is only running in that smaller piece of that larger district. And sometimes that's happened to create greater racial equity, so that we're encouraging a candidate of color to be more electable, as opposed to if you were to put them in the larger 3-member district. And so one of the debates that's happened in our current redistricting is whether to stay with multi-member districts or move away from multi-member districts. The governor had his own redistricting commission that created its own maps that focused a little bit more on busting up multi-member districts than the legislature seems to be inclined to do. So it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out. And one more point I will share with you all just about Maryland's redistricting process is that every state does it a little bit different. In some states, the redistricting process is the exclusive purview of the governor. And the governor's office leads the redistricting process, proposes the maps, and the General Assembly simply rubber stamps them, doesn't have the opportunity to change them. They just adopt them into law. And the governor truly drives that vote. In other states, the Secretary of State is responsible for redistricting and leads a commission who then comes up with the maps and similarly make the decisions for what the redistricting would look like. There's a 3rd category of states where the legislatures are responsible for the maps. They maybe draw them, maybe let others draw them, but at the end of the day, they've got the control over what's adopted and they can change them any way they like. They can propose their own maps, they can accept a proposed map, they can reject a proposed map, and Maryland falls into that 3rd category. In years where the party of the governor and the legislature has been the same, we have historically seen a collaborative map drawing process between the governor's office and the legislature. This year is the first time in my lifetime, and probably my lifetime plus 20 some odd years, where we've got the governor and the legislature's majority being different parties. And so what we've seen this year is that the governor did his own quote unquote bipartisan independent commission that created its own maps around redistricting. And the legislature has a legislative redistricting advisory commission that is advising the legislature about what the maps ought to be. That body also has representatives of both parties participating on it, but at the end of the day, one party has the majority in our legislature and has the votes to do what it wishes to do in terms of what those maps are going to look like. Like I said, political gerrymandering is not illegal. Racial gerrymandering is. And so what we're going to see is come early December, you'll probably see a lot of news articles comparing and contrasting what the Governor's Commission proposes, what the Legislative Commission proposes, how they're similar, how they're dissimilar, what they mean from a political power perspective, who is empowered based on the map that's selected. And at the end of the day, the legislature has the power to do exactly what it wants. It doesn't have to consider the governor's map at all. And if I'm being frank, very likely won't, because they don't have to. So even for Maryland, it looks a little different than it has 10 years ago or 20 years ago when we were going through this, because who's in power makes a difference in everything, in every decision, and redistricting is no different. But yes, we're talking about congressional districting. We're only talking about that House of Representatives, the national level. And when I say legislative, I'm certainly talking about at the state level. So thank you for that question. Anything else on redistricting? We are kind of down the road on redistricting now. So we really are at the point of watching what decisions get made and what maps are adopted for our state. And so that's what we're going to be keeping our eye on. So now let's talk about, in a bigger picture, the Maryland General Assembly. So let's get to know the Maryland General Assembly. And I'm going to share my browser screen for this, because I want you to get the chance to just see what our General Assembly's homepage looks like. I spend a lot of time on state legislatures' websites. Maryland, I would say, is not the best, but it's far from the worst in terms of user friendliness. It has come a long way since my legislative career began. And so there is a lot of information packed into this Maryland General Assembly website. If you just simply Google Maryland General Assembly, it comes up. It's not the most memorable website to just sort of know it, but if you Google it, it comes right up. It's got a wealth of information. It'll help you figure out who your representatives are. And this will tell you from presidents all the way down to the state legislature. So it'll tell you your congressional representative, who your senators are, who your legislative delegates are in the state of Maryland, and who your state senator is. I think it may also even tell you who your county executive is, and possibly even your county council member. You can look up any member of the Senate or the House. There are a number of legislative publications that you can find here. You can learn about the committees in the Senate and the House. Each has what we call standing committees who consider the legislation. There are 6 standing committees in the House and 4 standing committees in the Senate. They've all got names that kind of give you some peek into what they cover, but they've got very broad subject matter jurisdiction under each of them. And we talk about legislation in just a second. You'll be able to get some idea of how that kind of goes through. Here you can find the schedule. So once the session begins, here's where you would look up to see what committees are meeting and what bills they're going to be considering. And certainly, if the chapter would have an interest, let's say in January when the session is beginning, in doing a webinar focused specifically on like navigating the General Assembly session, I would be more than happy to assist you with that. Just to give people like that orientation when things are really happening on the ground. This is just the high level, give you a peek. Here you can look up Senate bills and House bills when they're in session. It will show you the legislation that's in, information about the state budget. You can look up actual in-force laws. Floor action is a topic we would talk about in that January session because it's more detailed than we're going to get through today. But at a high level, what I'll say is it's the way that bills move through the legislature. So this is where someone who is specifically tracking a bill gets some of that detail about what is happening with a particular piece of legislation. And then you can do searches, and there's archives. You can go back and watch committee hearings that happened years ago or last week, as well as a lot of other historical data can be found under searches and archives. The ticker here usually highlights important things that are coming. And when the legislature is in session, the status is up to date to let you know when their next meeting is going to be. Right now, they're adjourned. The term for that in Maryland is they're adjourned, sine die. And so that's all the status is saying. But when bills are being introduced, here's another place you can see what's been introduced. You can see synopsis of the bills, etc. So This is where I spend an enormous amount of my time gathering information, tracking the bills that I work on for my company. And it is certainly the hub of activity and keeping the public informed about what's going on in the Maryland General Assembly. I will say I love that you can sit at home on your computer and watch committee hearings live streamed every day that the committees are meeting. You can watch the House on the floor of the House of Delegates, and you can watch the Senate on the floor of the Senate of Maryland live streamed any day that they're meeting. I really like that transparency for what constituents and community members are able to see. So let's talk about reading a bill. So even though we may come together and talk a little bit more specifically about navigating a legislative session, just at a high level, I think it's still important as you hear bills talked about, you'll hear them in the news, and somebody will say, you know, such and so is going on with House Bill 214, and you may want to understand what that is for yourself. Let's talk about what a bill is and what a bill looks like. So when I send this out, there'll be a link to House Bill 1 of the 2021 session. Make sure that I'm sharing the bill. Here we go. All right, so here we are with House Bill 1. So House Bill 1, this is what a bill in Maryland looks like. They all have the same format. They've got the same elements on them, in them, and I'll point out what these elements are, and then I'll tell you what's the parts you really want to pay attention to if you attempt to take a look and read a piece of legislation. So each bill, one, as you see, is going to tell you obviously the bill's number. It's going to tell you who the sponsor is. In this case, it was sponsored by the Speaker of the House. It'll tell you even the date that it was requested, when it was introduced and quote unquote read the first time. There's a process for legislation. They're called readings. When a bill is introduced, it's called the first reading. Back in, as my niece likes to say, the olden days, when she asked me, you know, Auntie, do you remember the olden days? Back in the olden days, the bills were literally read word for word when they were introduced. As time has evolved, the legislatures here and at the federal level and across the country have adopted a process by which they take a vote to consider the bill having been read, instead of actually having to have the clerk read the bill. But in this case, you know, when it's introduced, it's read the first time. After the committee has heard the bill and acted on the bill, it goes back to the whole body, the whole House of Delegates or the whole Senate, and it's quote unquote read a second time. And if the committee has, you know, said this bill should pass, they'll report it out. If they say it needs amendments, they'll report the amendments. If they say that the bill should die, they'll report that. Bills that die don't get a third reading. The bills that move forward get read a third time, which is when they take a final vote. So bills get 3 readings: introduction, committee report, and final action are your 3 readings of the bill. And it will tell you when the bill was read for the first time, and it tells you the committee the bill is assigned to. Once the bill has been acted upon by a committee, it'll tell you the committee report and what the posture was. In this case, Appropriations reported the bill favorably, and the House action was to adopt the bill, and that committee report was read on February 11th, 2021. So it'll give you again that second reading date. Those are some of the more technical pieces of the bill, but it gives you a little perspective on the timing. Bills always have line numbers, so it's easy reference if you want to draw someone's attention to a piece of the bill. This portion up here of the bill is called the quote unquote purpose paragraph. And you see it starts with the words "for the purpose of." Every single bill will start with the words in the purpose paragraph "for the purpose of." It'll also have this title. So here, this bill was specifically about historically Black colleges and university funding. I tell folks who don't necessarily need to know all of this, don't worry with the purpose paragraph. It is written at a very high level. It doesn't really tell you what the bill does. It uses language like for the purpose of establishing certain new things or specifying certain funds. It doesn't really give you the detail. It's required by our drafting style in the state, but at the end of the day, it's very technical and it's not going to inform you about the real content of the bill. So I often say, don't spend your time analyzing the purpose paragraph. People get caught up in it and it won't make a lot of sense because it lacks detail. But if you come down here, it will tell you what parts of the Maryland law are being amended. The education article, for instance, state finance and procurement article here, state finance and procurement article, it'll tell you the specific section and whether something is being repealed and reenacted without amendments or repealed and reenacted with amendments. If something new is added, it will give you the instructions about how the proposed new law will fit into our existing law. And then when you get down here to what's labeled section 1 is when you get to the meat of your bill. You're trying to see what's being proposed to be changed. This is the part that you care about. You want to go to section 1, where it starts with be it enacted that the General Assembly of Maryland, by the General Assembly of Maryland, that the laws of Maryland read as follows. And here is where you find the law that's being proposed. What's important to know here is that how the text appears tells you things. So here we've got all bold caps text. Caps, all caps text is new language. That means this is language that does not exist in the law today. And so when something is being added to the code and you're trying to figure out what they're going to do different, you're looking for this language that's going to be new. You want to know what they're adding in to the law. The other, find a spot where it's showing it. When you see text like this, where it's traditional text, regular print text, this means this is existing law that's not being changed. So existing law already there, it's being included so that you've got context. Since I'm going to change something here, like add language in this section, it's hard for me to just put this in here and you don't know where it fits in. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the existing law, and then I'm going to show you what the new law is going to add into that existing law. And if I'm taking something out, it'll be bracketed, like you see the word and is bracketed here. Because here you had a list of things. They added an additional number to the list. So this and would now be out of place after 122, because we're not just ending at 123. They add a new and after 123, and then the new language of 124. If you look on the bill, let's see. Try to see where we usually place it. There's often a little key that'll tell you a little bit about what. Here on the first page, they also try to help you out by putting this explanation. Capitals indicate matter added to existing law. Brackets indicate matter deleted from existing law. Underlining indicates amendments, which means that it wasn't proposed to be added originally, but it got added later. So both caps and underlining both mean something has been added, and then strikeout means an amendment that took something out that originally was being left in. So both caps and underlines mean new, both brackets and strike-throughs mean removed. When you're reading a bill, understanding what's what is really half the battle. Once you understand what's new, what's old, what's staying, and what's going, then you can really put your mind to processing what is being proposed in a particular piece of legislation. The bill will then end with what's known as an enactment clause. This bill was an emergency bill, so it's got a specific enactment clause that says that it would have taken, well, this one did take effect upon signature of the governor, provided that it received 3/5 vote of the House and the Senate. And so it has a better than majority vote required to make it an emergency bill. Other bills that just sort of take place or take effect normally, it would have simply said, this bill will take effect October 1st, 2021, period. And that would have been your enactment clause that told you what day the law was going to take effect. That was really quick. It's a quick snapshot, but what I will also share so that it can be shared with those who attended today, the Maryland General Assembly has a great one-pager that also kind of walks you through all of this as a quick reference guide that I think would be great to distribute to the chapter and to all of your attendees, so that people have access to a cheat sheet to understand what it means when you're looking through a bill, and to help you remember what I shared with you today, because it's a lot to take in as you're looking to understand legislation. But I think for even a layperson to start to get that perspective about what it means and what the bill is doing, and how to read the bill, and how to understand what's new, what's old, and taking the time to just look at our laws for the first time can be really powerful in understanding the policies that are being set. So lastly, and I'm going to go through this quickly as well, when bills are being heard in the General Assembly, they take testimony, just like they took testimony on the redistricting plans. They take testimony in the hearings on bills. You can look up any bill and see what day it's scheduled for hearing. Last year, all the testimony was virtual. We're waiting to see if they're going to be virtual or in person in 2022. And any member of the public can come to Annapolis, or if we're doing it virtually, sign up to be on Zoom and testify about legislation that you think is worthwhile or you think is terrible, and let them know that you support it, that you oppose it, or that you think it could be better if they were to just change something about it. There are a couple of slides here to just sort of share things you will want to consider. And this applies whether you're testifying at the legislature or your county council or your school board meeting. But you want to always make sure you start by telling them who you are, your position on the bill, your brief take on what the bill does, why that's your position, any information that supports your position, and then reiterating your position. So in a really short version of that, right? That bill was about HBCU funding. If I were testifying on it, I would start by saying, good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm Kimberly Robinson. I'm a resident of Baltimore County, Maryland, and a lifelong Marylander. I am a strident supporter of our Maryland HBCUs and believe that more funding should be provided to these very important institutions. And so therefore I'm in support of House Bill 1. The bill is going to provide, and I would give a quick summary of the kind of funding that the bill is going to provide for our universities. I would tell them that that is important because HBCUs are a critical piece of ensuring access to higher education for African-American students. They serve a disproportionately high number of first-generation college students, and their sustained presence in our state is one of the great equalizers in creating access to education. So providing them proper funding is critical. I encourage this committee to vote favorably on House Bill 1. And if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them now. That is a very, very short version of what I would say. If I had more time, I would have added in more information, right? Statistics about HBCUs, something specific about the ones in Maryland, but made sure to impress upon them why my position is important, why it's correct, and why, as I always say, they ought to do what I say. We have 4 deltas in Maryland's General Assembly, so I always like to shout them out when I'm talking about the General Assembly. Maryland also has the largest Black caucus of any state legislature in the country, with more than 60 members of Maryland's Black caucus. Maryland is at this point by plurality a minority-majority state, so it's not entirely shocking. But again, it's really important how those districts get drawn because they influence who gets elected, and making sure that we keep a strong representation of legislators of color. And with that, thank you for the opportunity to present. I want to give a shout out to the other National Social Action Commissioners from the state of Maryland who have served alongside me for the last 4 years. And again, to thank the Harford County Alumni Chapter and the Harford County NAACP branch for the opportunity to quickly get through this very extensive presentation for you all tonight. I hope that it was informative, and with a little bit of time we have left, I'm happy to answer any.
Kimberly, thank you so much for all of that information. Definitely informative. We will make sure that any of the forms or documents that you send, that they are shared with all registrants for this evening. So kudos to you. And I'm going to ask, we'll open it up now for any questions or comments that want to be shared. I do want to make sure that everyone is very clear that everything, and as Kimberly said, everything that was shared here, so whether we're talking about a statewide legislative bill or whether we're talking about a policy or protocol change here at our local level, there are opportunities to advocate at all levels of government. So we want to encourage you, and I'm going to drop these links in. We want to encourage you to attend our county council meetings. which are held most Tuesdays. We want to encourage you to not only use your voice there. I was telling Kimberly right before we started that in the last 4 to 8 months at our county council meetings, at our Board of Education meetings, I've seen more people there, right, and engaged than the last 4.5 years that I've been going to those meetings. And that's great. We want that level of engagement. We want people to be involved in the process. But we also want people to know that the process doesn't stop there, right? And that there are ways that you can continue to utilize your voice in speaking with your council representatives and speaking with your state representatives to make sure that there are legislative changes, policy changes, protocol changes, because that is how we bring about sustainable reform. So I'm going to drop into the chat here the Board of Education meeting schedule, as well as the County Council meeting schedule, and really encourage everyone to make it a point to make some time just to attend those meetings so that you understand the people who are representing you and the decisions that are being made that will affect all of us within the county. Are there any questions? And feel free to come right off of mute and ask those questions yourself, or you can drop them into the chat. Any questions from the group?
I do love hearing that the participation has been up at your school board and your county council meeting. It really is important that people show up. And even if you don't have anything to say, just to be in the room and listen, and for them to know that people are watching, because sometimes the foolishness that we've seen out of any kind of deliberative body happens because they think they're doing it and nobody's paying attention.
That's right.
And we don't learn about it till somebody writes a news article about it weeks after something has gone down. And, it's much harder to do crazy things when there are people in the room watching you. And so it really does make a difference. I love seeing when SOARs will, rotate going to the meetings, but always show up in the red. So they always know, there's Delta in the room. Just so they know that even if we're not all there, then I'm watching for the group and I will be reporting back, and we are going to hold your feet to the fire. It's so important.
That's right. That's right. One of the last county council meetings, members of the NAACP, those of us who had NAACP shirts, we wore our shirts just to stand in support of organizations and people who are speaking about issues that are important to us. I do want to share some information. So historically, or at least for the past 5 to 6 years, the Harford County Delta chapter has partnered with the League of Women Voters in advance of each General Assembly session to make sure that our state and local representatives know exactly what our priorities are, what's important to us. And that's actually a closed session just between members of those two organizations and the legislators that join us. But after the general session, we have a session that is open to the public where we ask our state and local legislators to come back and tell us, what was the legislature that you proposed? How did things pan out? What were your priorities? What were you able to get pushed through and approved? What wasn't approved, so that we understand exactly what happened during the General Assembly. So please keep a lookout. We'll be sharing information for that, and that typically happens in the spring, April or May time after the General Assembly has concluded. The Maryland State General Assembly will run from January 12th through April 11th, 2022. So that is the time frame for the session.
And someone had asked in the chat who the members of Delta Sigma Theta were in the legislature. So here are the 4 of them. Charlotte Crutchfield from Montgomery County, Nicole Williams, I'm sorry, that's missing on Nicole's name, Nicole Williams from Prince George's County, Brenda Cham from Washington County, and Melissa Wells from Baltimore City are the 4 Deltas in the Maryland General Assembly.
We have another question in the chat. It says, where is final text of bill enacted in Maryland?
And give me 1 second, let's see. Gotta show you all how I found this. I'll share my screen so you can see how I'm doing this. I figure that's probably worth knowing. So let's see. Share screen, share my browser. So if you go on the Maryland General Assembly site, I went to the search tab, and the first thing under search is legislation. So you can pick which session you are looking for for a particular bill, right? So if I'm looking for an older bill, I'm looking for a bill from 2014, I can go back and pick 2014 regular session. If we're looking for special session bills, all the special sessions that have occurred over the many years are listed, and you see it doesn't go back forever, but it goes back to 1996 online. Anything past that, you'd have to go to the legislative archives in Annapolis. So if I'm looking for a 2020 regular session bill, I would select the session that I want. I would put in the bill number that I'm looking for, and it would pull up the bill. So this is the page for the bill we just talked about, House Bill 1. And one of the things they did add to our site that I do like for folks who are looking, this little process tab that lets you know kind of where a bill stands. So again, that first reading meeting was introduced. It was then referred to a committee. We saw that was the Appropriations Committee. We know it came back as a second reading, meaning the committee acted favorably on the bill. It had that third reading, which was the final vote in the House. Once the bill passes from the House, it gets sent to the Senate. So it starts that same process over again across the street in the other chamber. And you see it says original chamber, which was the House. Opposite chamber here was the Senate. It got a first reading in the Senate, meaning it was officially introduced in the Senate. It was referred to a Senate committee. It then was reported favorably or with amendments out of that Senate committee. It then had a final vote on the floor of the Senate, which is when it passed the Senate. It then gets returned to the original chamber. So House bills start in the House, go to the Senate, but they have to then be sent back to the House once the Senate is done with them. And then if there's changes made to the bill between the two houses, right? So the House passed version A and the Senate changed something. So now we'll call that version B of the same bill, and they agree on it, the House can just simply adopt the Senate's changes. If they don't agree with the Senate's changes, they can request what's called a conference committee, in which case 3 House members and 3 Senate members get appointed, and they go sit in a room and they fight it out over what the bill ought to look like until they come to an agreement, and which is called a conference committee report. And here this bill went to a conference committee, and then if they've come to agreement, the 2 chambers almost always will adopt the conference committee report. So then they'll each adopt the report. And once they've both adopted the same text of the bill is considered fully passed, and then it goes on to the governor. If you come on this page, if you click here, what's called a chapter, which says, chapter 41, the chapter language will show you the final version of the bill as it passed. There's also a couple other places you could see it. That's the easiest way to see a final bill. If the bill did not pass, it will not have a chapter number. So if you were to open this up and you saw a bill and it said the House bill number, but there was no chapter number, that bill did not pass in that General Assembly session. But if there is a chapter number, it means that the bill passed. Or if you look down here at status, it says approved by the governor, again, chapter 41. You can come here and you could see the committee hearing. The little camera will let you know that you could watch that Appropriations Committee hearing. There's also the committee hearings that were held in Budget and Tax and Education, Health and Environment in the Senate, who both had jurisdiction over the bill. You can see testimony that was submitted and who were the witnesses. All of that is there. The detailed history in terms of literally what day each of these things happened is there. If you wanted to, sort of nerd out with me and look at every step along the way to see what occurred with the bill along the way, this history gives you the detailed timeline of how a bill passed through the House. And then, there's some other, file code is a very technical thing just for, archivists. Subject is high level. So if you were searching by subject, these are all the subjects that might have led you back to this bill. And then statutes, just like the bill listed them in the top, this also tells you which articles of the code and which statutes are actually effective. But any bill that actually passed and became law will have a chapter number. So that's the easiest way to get to the final version of the bill. Change the to show you the final version. So this is that you see it. This version now says chapter 41 and has the governor's name. So that's how you know that's the final version of the bill. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Kimberly. There was a comment in the chat about having a similar overview of the process at the Harford County Council level. And I think that is a great request for us to make of our council, right? We want full transparency. We want to understand the timeline. We want to understand the process. We want to understand where we can provide additional input outside of just the county council meetings. Of course, you can always reach out to your county council president and members, reach out to their staff. You can send letters and all of that. But I think, JB, that was your comment. And I think that's a great request to make sure that we are holding our council accountable for making sure that we're informed of that process. Very good comment. There is a survey that we've dropped into the chat as well. So if everyone could make sure that you take the time to complete that survey, we may have some additional questions that we'll follow up with via email. And then we'll also make sure that we are sharing any documents that may be a great reference to you as well. Kimberly, again, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us this evening and for a very informative presentation. I hope that every single person who's joined us this evening is leaving feeling a little more empowered to engage in an even stronger and greater way and utilize your voice in that way. Your voice matters. Our voices matter. And we have to make sure that we are showing up when they are talking about topics, changes, legislature, policies, protocols that affect us. So thank you so much to each and every person for joining this evening. I'll do another quick check of the chat to make sure that we haven't had any additional questions joined in there. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you for making it a priority. I look forward to seeing you at County Council and Board of Education meetings and other community activities. And please take a minute to fill out the survey. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for the opportunity. Kudos to the Harford County Alumni Chapter and the NAACP branch for Harford County for tonight's event. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kim.
Thank you.
So happy to see so many members of partner organizations, NAACP, League of Women Voters, of course, the members of the Harford County Delta chapter, the members of the Coalition for Equal Justice in Harford County. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. We appreciate it. Good night, everyone. Have a good night.